This is the first time I've ever worn one of these, and I feel like I'm about to do a TED Talk. Anyway, so I am the founder of Cortney Consulting, which is the parent company of all of my various endeavors, and there are way too many for me at this point. But Friends with Holograms is the company that I just founded, and that's one of my primary focuses at this point. And I know it's a strange name. I will explain what it is as we go through the presentation, but it's basically a VR agency to help brands and ad agencies understand virtual reality. And so I do a lot of work in VR. I've been in VR for about 2 years now. The first VR piece I saw was an art and music piece in January of 2015, and it completely changed my life. It revolutionized the way I think about immersive art and how we can experience art and video together. And once I saw that, I just was like, that's it, I'm working in VR, I've got to figure out a way to get in. So I started thinking about VR, writing about VR, researching VR, meeting people in VR. And about a year and a half ago, I started working with a production company. I was their head of business development for about a year. And the whole reason I got interested in this topic was because a TV network came to us and they wanted to do a horror experience. And they wanted to do something that was based on a plot where someone was hiding in a refrigerator box and the killer in the experience was stabbing through the box. And we built a prototype, and it was truly terrifying. I have never felt more afraid for my life than I have in that moment. And we wound up not doing it. The pitch fell apart. We didn't get the funding. It was, it was what it was. That happens in VR all the time. But that got me thinking about, VR is so immersive. And in what ways can you really manipulate someone's mind in VR? And that got me thinking about what are the ethical limits of virtual reality and what are the considerations that we need to take into account when we make VR. So the first part is that VR can evoke both empathy and fear, right? How many of you have ever heard the expression that VR is the empathy machine? That's kind of a couple of people, yeah. So that's been a common talking point in the VR space for a while. And it's correct, right? There are plenty of great VR experiences people can watch where you feel like you are in someone's world, you're part of someone's life. It gives you a new perspective on a situation that you might not have known very much about, or you might have seen a lot of skewed or biased media coverage of. It's a way for people to connect on a really human level. So that's great, right? You look at this image and you can see one of two things. You either see this woman and her child and they're in a really difficult, terrible situation, and it either gives you a sense of empathy where you're like, oh, this woman's in a horrible situation, what can I do to help her situation improve? Whether that's donating to the Red Cross, whether that's working with refugees, whether that's just learning more about the situation that she happens to be in. But there's a downside, which is it can just create a sense of strong fear, right? So you could have a VR experience where just as easily someone is telling you, no, these people are coming to take over your community, they're coming to wreak havoc, they're coming to take your jobs. You could very easily use this image to create a sense of fear and anguish in people. And in VR, that's something because it's so immersive and you get so into the experience and you do feel like you're connecting with someone, that if you're telling a story that's a fearful story or a negative story, that's something that'll stick with people a lot longer than anything they might see just on a traditional flat screen, right? Images go by on the flat screen so quickly, but images in VR, because they're so much closer to you and you're surrounded by them, they create a much deeper impact. Then we start getting into the more dystopian stuff, right? So what I'm about to talk about next may or may not happen, but it's still worth considering, right? So that's what happens when you can't take the headset off. So to go back to the first experience I was talking about, the horror experience, right? I knew I could take that headset off at any moment, right? I was testing it, I was demoing it, but I knew that if it got too scary, I could just headset off and I'm out. And I've done that. I've done that plenty of times. I've been in experiences that I thought were, boring, or made me sick, or just, they were scary experiences and I didn't feel like being scared. And I was just like, yeah, I'm good with this, right? But then what happens when you can't take the headset off? What happens when it's on your head permanently? And I know that's a strange thing to think about, but think about it this way. Think about the context of torture, right? So, if someone is holding the headset on your head, that's not going to leave any real marks, right? In many situations where there's torture happening, there will be physical marks. Someone just holding a headset on you and not letting you take it off, that's not going to make a mark, right? But what it can do is manipulate your mind in such a terrifying way that's going to do way more psychological damage to you than anything you could really think of that would do physical damage. So, one thing I was thinking of was it's very common for interrogators to threaten someone's family, to say, like, if you don't tell us what we want to hear, we'll go after your wife or your kids or your parents or whoever. But, they can kind of think about what that would look like, but it's hard for them to really grasp it. But if you created a VR experience where that was actually happening, where you could create a fictionalized experience, say in a game engine, where, oh my God, it does look like someone's village has been bombed, or someone's house has been destroyed, or someone's family has been hurt or killed, you put that experience on them, and they're in that experience, and they honestly think that's real. That's terrifying, right? That's the way, you can get people to talk, but that's also a deep form of psychological torture that is really terrifying to think about. And we're capable of doing that right now. This is something that could be done right now with the technology that we have. I don't know that it is being done. I really hope it's not being done. But there's nothing in the Geneva Conventions about torturing someone in a VR headset because it's not physical torture. It's all psychological. And it's all fiction, right? The defense could be, oh yeah, we just made it up. We just wanted to test this person's limits. And so, we just made it up. In the police, in the US anyway, it's totally legal for a cop, if they're questioning you, to say, oh, your accomplice confessed, so we just need to know, that you agree with him. Or we found the body, we just need you to tell us what happened. And of course, they haven't found anything, and no one has confessed, but they can lie to you in order to get you to say what they want you to hear. You can take it one step further with VR. And so that's where things start to get really scary. And again, I know this is dystopian, because I know this technology is all really new. But this is stuff that we need to think about, because as we move forward with this technology, we need to make sure that this is stuff that we address and we control for. So here's the other side of it, right? How can you manipulate emotions in virtual reality? So this is a piece that I actually worked on. It's coming out later this year. And this is meant to make you fall in love with someone in VR. So the point of this piece was we took the 36 questions article from the New York Times, the 36 questions to make you fall in love with anyone. And we asked these different actors and actresses to respond to the questions. And we filmed them. And then you put on the headset and you ask them a scripted question. So you pick a question. And then they look at you and they answer sincerely. And right now, given the limits of technology, it honestly feels like a little bit like being on a Tinder date. It's a little bit first date vibes where you're with someone and they're really attractive and they're really friendly, but you're sort of doing that like ask you a question, answer a question, interview type of style because you're still getting to know them. So, it's a cool experiment. I'm glad we did it. But it only scratches the surface to where we can go with this stuff, right? Because in the coming years, we're going to see advancements in artificial intelligence and natural language processing, not to mention virtual reality technology, where you can actually have conversations with people two ways. So instead of just asking a scripted question and getting an answer from an actress that's been pre-recorded, you could create an artificially intelligent being that could then answer questions based on keywords. Which is kind of interesting, right? For like a customer service perspective or something like that. It's kind of interesting. But there are now companies doing things where they can take samples of people's voices and create a sample based on someone's voice saying something that they wouldn't say, right? So that has tremendous potential for fake news and manipulation. But beyond that, there are companies that are taking people's record, whether that's their spoken record, videotapes of them, anything, and taking all the data and based off that data, creating answers, conversational answers based on an algorithm. So let's say you wanted to ask John F. Kennedy about Twitter. Okay, obviously he's not gonna have an answer for that. He was dead for 50 years before Twitter was even an idea, but you can sort of tell based on the extensive record what he would have thought about something like Twitter based on his thoughts on communication, on public discourse, on politics in the media, politics on television. So again, this has great educational possibilities. But the downside is you can put words in someone's mouth. And if you're in a situation where it feels like you are talking to someone in VR and that person tells you something that they may or may not have actually said, that feels very real and that feels very believable. And in the age of fake news that we're in right now, that's really terrifying because that's the next step. So, like I said earlier, the name of my company is Friends with Holograms. And the vision that I have is 10 years down the road, we will actually be living in this world. I don't know how many of you recognize this. It's kind of a deep cut, but it's from the Hamlet on the holodeck episode of Star Trek. And basically on the holodeck, you go up to the holodeck and you can start a performance. So you can either take an existing performance, like Hamlet, for example, or any play, and you can put yourself in as a character, and the other characters will respond to you based on your performance and your needs. So you don't have to just go up there and perform part of Hamlet. You don't have to stick to the script, but those characters will respond to you based on who those characters are. So where we're going in 10 years or 15 years is this idea that you can dial up a hologram and they will be programmed to respond to you, okay? So that's kind of interesting if you want to play Act Hamlet on the holodeck. Where that gets interesting and kind of scary is the connections that you form with these people, because it's not like Siri, right? Like Siri's not a real person. She's an algorithm. And it's not like, we've seen those movies about men who fall in love with their voice assistants or men who fall in love with like robots. These are clearly not people. To the person to fall in love with them, maybe they are, but they're not actual people. The issue is if you have a hologram version of a pop star or an actor or a celebrity or a politician, are you really talking to that person? Do you have a really deep relationship with the Kim Kardashian hologram that you talk to every day after school? And like, where do those lines get kind of blurry, right? I mean, you are talking to her in the sense that you're talking to an algorithm based on her identity and her ideas, but you're not really talking to her. And then how do those relationships work in people's minds? So that's where things to me start to get really interesting. And I know that's kind of a leap from the VR experiences that you might have watched today where you're like skiing down a mountain or watching a movie or something like that. But this is where we're going. And it's not good or bad. It's just something that we need to keep in mind because we do need to create norms and ideas and possibly even legislative things about what we've talked about. So how do we make sure VR is used for good, right? So the first thing is obviously to prevent things like torture, we need to make sure that that's regulated, whether that's by the United Nations, it's in the Geneva Convention, other international bodies. We also need to start thinking about creating norms in terms of VR creation. And it's kind of the Wild West right now, right? You have all these independent VR creators just going out and making cool content. But what we really need to make sure that we do is create a series of norms where you cannot manipulate people's minds in a certain way. And that's going to be really tricky. We've already seen, in the United States anyway, media norms get destroyed in the last several years. So we need to make really sure that with VR, we don't go down the same path where we've got fake news VR all over the place and people are even more immersed in it than they are just watching the regular television news right now. So we really need to make sure, and you can create horror experiences and scary experiences and sad experiences, political experiences in VR, and that's great. I don't think VR should just be something that's used to, be Pollyanna-ish and just educate people about the sad world around us, right? You can make a really cool, compelling, scary VR experience, but people have to consent to that. And I had a conversation earlier today with a young man who talked about VR and pornography, and that's not something I really touch on in this talk, but I think it's the same issue. It's the issue of consent, right? So you can make a VR, a sexual VR piece that, whatever floats your boat, but as long as everyone involved is a consenting adult, that's fine. The issue becomes when there's not consent involved. There need to be very, very clear laws and norms and restrictions around that. So that's me. We've got a couple minutes left for questions. I'd be happy to chat with you more. And thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Hi, guys. How are we? Do we have any questions in the house? Just throw your hand up in the air like you just don't care. Yeah, there's one over there. We'll just get you the speaker.
I know it's really hot in here, guys, too. I'm like...
Thanks.
Schwitzing. So thanks for sticking it out while we're all like sweating.
Thank you for the talk. And my question is, don't you feel that VR develops faster than the legislation of VR? So even in future that like this torture could be like executed, but the legislation would be like after the first victims or something. Like,
yeah.
Is there any ideas how to keep in track like legislation and development?
So technology almost always moves faster than legislation. I think we've seen that with the internet, definitely. I mean, you look at the internet's development and then how long it took to actually create meaningful legislation and restriction around it. There's no way to go backwards, unfortunately. I think right now we just need to really start having those discussions and making sure that people know that this is a thing that is possible, that exists, and then talking to legislators and talking to the UN and talking to folks and really making sure they understand the ramifications of this, and then advocating for sensible restrictions to be in place. I mean, there's just no way to, unwind the clock. But I think moving forward, it's just making sure that this is something that's regulated.
Cool. Any other questions?
Anything else?
Over here. I love it when that.
Oh my gosh!
Really
Good catch.
It's called
job.
box. You meant to throw it.
Yeah, so I read this article a while back where they did an experiment on kids where they gave them VR, and after about a week they called them back for an interview and they could not distinguish between reality and virtual reality anymore. Like, could you say something about what your thoughts on this are when it comes to kids interacting with virtual reality?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, first of all, I don't think that's just limited to virtual reality. So there's an article that went around a couple months ago, it was on BuzzFeed, I believe, where there's this whole subreddit of people who swear up and down that, I want to say it was Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player, or no, it was Sinbad, the comedian, that Sinbad was the star of a movie about a genie that came out in the 90s, and it was this huge hit, and this is not just one or two random people. Hundreds of people are part of this Reddit community that say they remember this, except this movie never happened. So there was a movie about a genie that had another famous African-American comedian in it, and Sinbad somehow got infused into this. And anyway, the point is, kids especially confuse fantasy and reality. We've also, in a much darker example, we saw this happen in the United States in the early 80s, where police departments convinced children that they had been victims of all sorts of terrible crimes because there was a sex panic around daycare centers, right? So I don't think VR is anything new when it comes to false memories in young people. I think that's just a thing that occurs. There hasn't been enough research done on kids in VR to really make any claims either way. I think that the best thing you can do with kids in VR is monitor their use, just like any other screen. I've put young children in VR. I'd make sure they don't stay in it for more than 10 minutes at the most. I make sure they don't use it more than a few times a week. There are sensible ways to monitor your kids' use of VR, and I think it's okay for kids to use VR occasionally. I certainly wouldn't put a child in VR all the time, but I wouldn't put anyone in VR all the time. I'm not even in VR all the time. So yeah, I mean, I think the sort of more research needs to be done.
Cool.
Anyone
Questions? I have one.
Sure.
Have you heard of Simon Sinek?
No.
Okay, so he talks about the whole our generation, millennials, being addicted to our phones, and that every time it rings, there's a hit of endorphins. What fears do you have for the younger? Going along with the things, what fears do you have
For Gen Z, is that what we're calling them
Yeah,
now?
sure.
I teach kids that are Gen Z. I teach 19, 20-year-olds, which still blows my mind. These kids were born in 1997, and that freaks me out. But yeah, I think, I know, hashtag old people problems. I think there's, some of these kids might spend too much time in VR, and just like some of these kids might spend too much time looking at their phones. The upside, though, is that they're exposed to so much more than I was ever exposed to growing up. They're much more, I think, independent and able because of all the exposure that they have to make better decisions and be more empathetic because they've seen more, right? So yeah, I think there will be a subset of the population that gets addicted to VR, just like people get addicted to their phones or video games or watch too much TV or listen to the radio too much or whatever. But I think generally, it's going to be a really positive development for younger kids.
Cool.
Cool.
And how do you get to the half marathon kind of distance?
You just have to run every day.
Oh,
That's I know. That's the answer no one wants to hear.
Work.
Sorry. I know that's really all there is to it is you just have to run.
Do you ever think that virtual reality maybe I could just do VR running instead?
You know what? I've actually tried. I put on a headset and ran on a treadmill once. I would not recommend it. Don't you can do an exercise bike and a headset and it's pretty cool. don't run on a treadmill and a headset. Trust me, you will embarrass yourself very badly. Like if you take no other lesson from this talk, don't wear a headset on a treadmill. Like, yeah, don't torture people in VR, but really don't wear a headset on a treadmill.
So there you go. Don't wear a headset on a treadmill. Big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much.